Hello everyone, and welcome to part 4 in the series in using Blender's game engine for architectural visualization. And in the last part we had finished creating our textures. So what I want to do now is I want to plug all of the original image textures back into the diffuse shaders for each material, because we're going to create a reflection map that can be used in GLSL. And what it will essentially be is just an HDRI image. And there's an easier way to do this by just setting up the camera to do a panoramic render. But in this instance, I like using a different method, and I'll explain why once we get into setting up GLSL materials for different objects. Now I'm going to type Shift A and add a UV sphere. And I'm going to position it so that it's in the center of the room, so that the distance between the sphere and the ceiling is the same as the sphere and the floor. Okay, now I'm going to type T to bring up the options to the left and make sure that the shading is set to smooth. That, of course, is very important. And now I'll tab into edit mode. Then press Z to go into wireframe, and then C to use the face selection tool, and then just select all of these triangle faces and then use I to inset them. And I'll do that a second time. And then I'll type X and delete those faces. Now if I go to Edge Select and I hold Alt and click on this back edge, it will select the entire loop. And if I type Control E, I can select Mark Seam. And the reason for deleting the triangle faces at the top and bottom of the sphere is because we're going to be unwrapping this so that it's completely flat. And if we had triangles, they would not have unwrapped evenly with all of the quads. So I'm going to create a new texture, and it's going to be called Reflection Map. I'll keep the width at 1024, but I'll change the height to 512 pixels and click OK. And now we have a sort of rectangular texture for our HDRI image. And so I'll come down to Face Select and select one of the faces in the front. And if I were just to unwrap this, now it wouldn't unwrap into a perfectly even square. So instead I'll type U and choose Reset. Which now it's rectangular, but at least all of the sides are even. So I can just scale this on X until it's evenly square, and then I'll scale it down. And now I'll come up to my sphere and select everything with A, making sure that the face I originally unwrapped is still active, and then I'll type U and choose Follow Active Quads. And it's important that the UVs take up as much of the texture space as possible. You don't want any areas on the top or the bottom to be empty texture space, because that will show up in the reflection map. So make the UVs fit as best as possible within the texture space. Okay, so now we're ready to give it a material. So I'll come over and click New, and then change it from diffuse to glossy, and then we'll view that in rendered view. Now we want to bake all of that reflection onto the texture that we created. Actually, before we set up our bake settings, let's split the screen at the bottom and open up the node editor. Now I'll type Shift A and add a texture, image texture. And then I'll open that texture that I created, which is Reflection Map. And remember, it's important to keep this texture node highlighted when you bake. So here in the render settings, we could just bake this as it is. I'm going to save first. And actually, let me check my sample settings, because that of course is important too when baking reflection, because you can get a lot of noise. Mine currently is set to 2000, which is maybe a bit high for a reflection map, so I'll set that down to 500. And everything else looks good, so I'll click bake. Then when it's finished, you'll have what will work as a pretty effective reflection map, or HDRI texture, to apply to different objects in your scene. So we no longer need the sphere, so we can delete it. And now let's switch from Cycles Render to Blender Game. Then we need to delete all of the materials, all of the Cycles materials that we have applied. So we'll delete this one and then select the roof, delete its material, and then the floor, and delete that material as well. Because we'll be adding GLSL materials, so we need to change the shading from multi-texture to GLSL. And come to our textured view. And immediately you can see it looks a little strange because you have all of those very hard shadows from the sun lamp, but we can fix that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the portals that we used in Cycles and delete them because they don't have any function in the Blender game engine. And then I'll change the sun lamp to a hemisphere lamp, or a hemi lamp, which lights the scene a little more evenly than the sun lamp. And I'll increase the energy to 3. Alright, so now let's start working on our materials. So first I'm going to name the floor, because it's just a good idea to name all of the objects in your scene, especially when you have a lot of objects in your scene. Now we have this material that we can apply our texture to, and then we can create a new material for the reflection and then combine those both together in the node editor. So I'll call this floor texture, and then click on the texture tab and click new and open. And then I'll go to the file where I have all of those textures that we created in GIMP and select the floor diffuse JPEG, which was the floor, the wood texture with the shadows included, of course. Now I'll come down to the next texture slot and click new and then open and go back to wherever you have your textures stored. This time I'll choose the floor normal map. And I did not convert this to a PNG or to a JPEG. I should have. It's still PNG, which is a bit larger of a file size, so you may want to. But under image sampling, I'll click normal map. And then under geometry, I will check normal and then deselect the color under diffuse settings. And initially, the normal strength is too strong, so I'll take it down. Somewhere between a 0.2 and 0.3 is probably good enough in this instance. But of course, it's all very specular and glossy now, so we need to use our Specularity Map. So if we go back up, we'll go under to the third texture slot, then click open, and then find the floor spec map that we added the shadow map to. Remember, we have 2, so the one with the shadow map included. Now let's scroll down to under the influence and uncheck color, and then under specular, check the intensity, color, and hardness. And that has it working properly. It used to be that if you checked the intensity box, then when you went over to your material settings, you had no control over the intensity under the specular settings. But now it appears that you do, which is good. So you can still control the amount of specularity from the material settings as well. And now the entire floor is specular, but it's most specular in terms of its intensity where the sun is touching the floor. So in the brighter areas, it's more specular. Now let's add a new material, and we'll call this one Floor Reflection. And we'll come over to our Texture tab click New, and then Open. And then we need to find where we saved the reflection map. And then we will set the coordinates, the mapping coordinates from UV to reflection. And we also need to go back to our material settings and take the specularity intensity all the way down, because we already have our specularity settings set for the floor texture. All right, so now let's create a new material. And I'll call it Floor Material Nodes. And then tab into Edit Mode and assign that material to the floor. And then I can bring up my node editor. And at the bottom, check Use Nodes, which gives me my material node, which is plugged into an output node. So if I come over here and click the little Material tab, I can select the floor texture material. And this, of course, has all of the diffuse, normal, and specular information applied to it. Then if I duplicate this node with Shift-D, then from the material settings, I can select the floor reflection material. Now if I hold Alt and right-click, I can drag them together and combine them with a Mix RGB node. And that, of course, only works if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. And so now the reflection is mixed with the diffuse material, but there are some problems. First of all, the reflection is a little too strong. And second of all, it's not taking the normal map into consideration, which it should for it to look more realistic. And so the first thing I like to do is change the mix type from mix to add and leave it at a value of 50%. This, of course, is just a preference, and you can experiment with different types of mix values and types. But for me, this works best. Now we need to apply the normal map. So let's go Shift-A and then input geometry. And then Shift-A, input texture. And then Shift-A vector normal map. And then we'll plug the UV into the vector of the texture, and then we will plug the normal into the color of the normal map, and select the floor normal texture, and plug the normal map into the normal input of the material node. And then I also, again, I use a very low strength. So if I hold Shift, I can go up in small increments to get a really good subtle effect for the reflection map. And in this instance, I think 0.06 is a good value. But there's still a problem in that in real life, reflections are strongest and most sharp when you're viewing them from an angle. And currently there isn't a node that can do this in the Blender game engine, but fortunately there is one in the Cycles render engine. So if we switch over to Cycles render, now we can type Shift-A and go to Input and then choose Layer Weight. Okay, so now let's switch back to the Blender game engine. And we want to take the facing value and plug it into the factor of that mix shader. And now you can see what that does. It kind of takes the reflection away, or at least seemingly takes it away when you plug it in. But then when you view the floor at a lower angle, then the reflection becomes more pronounced. And this is how a real-world material would work. You know, again, with these really glossy, flat surfaces, the lower of an angle in which you're viewing them, then the sharper the reflection will be. So now let's work on the wall material, which will be far less complicated than the floor material because we won't even need to use nodes. So let's first rename it. So we'll call this walls. And then we'll change the material name to wall texture. And then click on the texture tab. and then open up the wall diffuse texture. Okay, and we have these faces that we said we were going to delete, again, because we won't be viewing them from the perspective of the center room. We'll never see those outside walls, so it's always good to delete anything that won't be visible. Alright, so now let's apply the normal map. So we'll go to the next texture slot and click New and Open. And then find the Walls normal map. And just like before, we will go check the normal map tab and then uncheck color, and then check normal under geometry, and again adjust this value so that it's relatively low. You definitely want the detail in the brick to come out, but you don't want it to be too strong that it creates too many dark and unnatural shadows. And now we can add the specularity texture. So walls spec map. And we'll uncheck color under diffuse and then intensity, color, and hardness under specular. And it may be a good idea to readjust the normal value after you apply the specular map to get a little more of a detailed or accurate look to that normal effect. Alright, so I think our room is starting to look pretty good. So the last material that we need to do is apply the texture to the ceiling, which is going to be the easiest of all of the materials because we probably won't even do a normal map or anything. It'll just be a very simple material. So we'll select it, then come to the materials and click New. And then we'll change the name to ceiling. And we'll change the material name as well to ceiling texture. And then we'll click the texture tab and create a new texture and open, and then find the ceiling diffuse texture. And so the only problem with this material currently is that there is this weird specularity that shows up, and it doesn't have any normal map geometry to sort of displace that specularity. So one solution is to turn the specularity all the way off. And personally, I would go with this method. But if you wanted some specularity to the ceiling, then you could go to your texture settings and scroll all the way down, and under the specular settings you could check maybe color and hardness, maybe uncheck hardness and just keep color, which just uses the color values, and then check the normal under geometry. And even though this isn't a normal map, it will still take the values into consideration when it's trying to interpret where the height and depth is of that texture. And so now the last thing I would do is just create a little bit of bounce light, which the Blender game engine doesn't do naturally, so you kind of have to fake it. So we can take our hemisphere lamp and type Shift D to duplicate it, and then rotate it on, in this case, Y, 180 degrees, so that it's facing the opposite direction that the original is facing. And this just bounces some light back onto those shadowed walls to create a little more of a well-lit atmosphere in your room. But I think that's going to be it for this video. We still have a lot to do in this series. We're still going to try to replicate a lot of those cycles materials like glass and the glossy shader and even some of the more obscure shaders like the velvet shader, and do lots of cool things, create shaders that we can use in GLSL, in the game engine. And of course, we still have to actually get into the logic of game engine stuff, so the logic editor and getting our game working. But that will be in the coming episodes. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.